All right, and our last speaker for today is Tamara. Tamara after HMS, did her residency at the Wilmer Eye Institute at Hopkins in Baltimore, and then performed a fellowship in ophthalmology at USC at the Heaney Institute. And she's climbed through the ranks at Rush and is currently a professor of ophthalmology at Rush, specializing in plastic and reconstructive ophthalmologic surgery. And Tamara's going to close out the day with us here, and has no slides, and is in many ways the most interesting title. At least I'll just read the opening. How my granny is smarter than a medical student. And I think many of us would say yes to that.
He asked if I wanted the slides off, and I don't know how I follow a year-long erection. Maybe we should have left that up. Should have that to follow. Well, what a day of reunion and communion. For me and my fellow class of aviators, the hosts of this reunion weekend, it's been a quarter of a century since we last sat in a lecture hall like this together. And like most of my classmates for this 25th reunion, we've also recently hit a milestone, turning 50. And in fact, when I considered a title for this talk, I thought about 50. Is it the new 25? And sure, when I wake up with plantar fasciitis, I do fantasize a little about being 25 again. And in fact, Ed said, I wish I could be, I told him, I said, I wish I could be 25 with my 50-year-old mind. And Ed said, heck, if I could be 25, I'll take my 25-year-old mind. But I don't know about you, but when I was 25, I was pretty unformed. And how can one have an appreciation for the richness of the fabric of our lives as a 25-year-old? For most of us, we simply hadn't lived long enough. When we left these hallowed halls, we may have stopped being professional students, but we didn't stop learning. So here are 3 lessons I've learned since I was 25, and they have to do with perspective, resilience, and gratitude. 2 weeks ago, I removed a twig that had been festering for 2 months deep in the eye socket of a 3-year-old who run into a bush while sledding in March. I reassembled the fragments on the Mayo stand and pulled out my phone to take a picture. But before I snapped, I asked the scrub to put a ruler next to the twig because without some type of standard, there was no way to gauge the size of that object. It was 4 centimeters, by the way. What the picture needed was perspective. I also needed a little perspective 25 years ago. My classmates and I, we were all cramming for step 2 of the national boards, camped out at Count Wade, swirled away in the crooks and crannies of Dandy. There was a dining hall there back then, and making clandestine late-night runs for Sammy Falafels. All the while, trying not to let the sight of all of our classmates doing exactly the same thing send us into a death spiral of insecurity, self-doubt, and misery. It was, up to that time, the singularly most stressful period in my life. The pass rate was around 95%. I was absolutely resolute that I would be in that other 5%. I recall talking on the phone to my grandmother as the exam approached. She had little formal education. She was married at 15, a mom at 16. She lived her entire life within a 3-mile radius of her birthplace on the outskirts of an Appalachian, Virginia factory town. I complained to her how hard it was to study for this board exam, how difficult the questions would be, how I heard of HMS students far more intelligent than I who had flunked this test. She interjected, well, baby, what happens if you fail? Hearing her put into words thoughts that I had tried to push to the back of my mind, I choked up in a barely disguised low way, like, oh God, Granny, I'd have to take the test again. There was a pause, and her tone, until now empathic, had changed, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. She chastened, and in the sweet and gentle way only a grandmother can. You mean they let you take the test? You can still go on and be a doctor? And she was right. I might fail the test, but with some remediation, and God willing, I would not fail in my quest to become a doctor. So my advanced Ivy League degree was no match for the considerably cheaper school of hard knocks from which my granny graduated. And I was not part of that 5% after all. Another trait, often in short supply in most 25-year-olds, is resiliency. The ability to bounce back from, you pick it, rejection, failure, disgrace, or any other life obstacles. Admit it, at 25, most of us in this room were not well-versed at failure and rejection. We wouldn't have been here if we had. But by now, few of us have escaped the inevitable setbacks, sucker punches to the gut, and curveballs that life seems to throw more and more of as the years tick by. After HMS, I did not go residency. Between PGY 1 and 4, I got married and had 2 children. I'm not necessarily recommending my family planning method, nor someone to search accurately lack thereof, but I managed to give birth twice during training and still be on speaking terms with my fellow residents as well as my chairman. As residency wrapped up, I decided to pursue a fellowship in ophthalmic, plastic, and reconstructive surgery. I blithely hit the interview trail, 7 months pregnant with my second child. I had 7 interviews across the country with 7 fellowship directors, all men, whom I expected to look past my in-your-face fecundity and conclude, yes, for 2 years we want you to handle all the resident teaching, after-hours call, and attending SPET, on top of managing 2 toddlers while your husband is halfway across the country. One preceptor, apparently reading from the Handbook of Illegal Questions, inquired, did you plan these pregnancies? Followed it up with, what does your husband think about this? Despite encounters like this, I thought cluelessly, why would I not be an excellent and competitive candidate? I actually had the nerve to be surprised when I did not match. So I finished residency, G2, P2, unemployed, with no plan B for what to do next. My husband's job moved us to Chicago. 1 year of full-time mommyhood turned into 2, with my clinical skills and professional confidence deteriorating. I did manage to become skilled expert in body fluid management, pediatric conflict resolution, and belting out the mind-numbing cadence of Barney's theme song. One classically raw Chicago day with the kids down for a nap, I went through the mail. It was my monthly journal, Ophthalmology. And as I flipped through, always from back to front, a strange tick of mine, I came across an article written by one of my residency classmates. So here was my classmate, stamping out blindness, building his academic CV, while the only thing I was getting good at was folding a double-wide McLaren stroller with one hand with an infant on my hip. And I was really good at it. I'm grateful that there was no Facebook back then. How to cope with a low moment in life, with the constant news feed of triumphs and exploits of your hundreds of friends. My daughter, who was practically raised on Facebook, just graduated from Georgetown, and she struggled to land her first job. She is further demoralized because, according to her feed, everyone has a great job and a great new apartment, but me. In the socially hyper-connected world, I had to introduce my daughter to the principle of selection bias. Until I see a post like, my girlfriend left me, I defaulted on my student loan, and I'm moving back home with mom and dad, LOL, I'll keep Facebook at arm's length. So, back to my classmate's article. I still don't know why I reacted the way I did. I have a feeling sleep deprivation played a role, but I crumbled to the floor, my chest heaving with sobs. I lay there in a fetal position for a few minutes, my tears running sideways across the bridge of my nose. As my breathing quieted, I realized something, actually 2 things. My son's binky, long-thought loss, was there, under the sofa, next to a desiccated Cheerio and a dust bunny. But the second thing I realized was this. So I didn't match on the first try. So I hadn't seen a patient or held a surgical instrument in 2 years. Did that mean I shouldn't or couldn't give it another go? I had to try, and if I didn't do it now, I may never get the courage again. In that moment, I picked myself up, quite literally, off that carpeted floor, and figuratively, resolving to dust myself off and get my professional life back on track. I did end up getting a fellowship in LA nonetheless, epicenter of facial plastic surgery, and 3 years later, I returned to Chicago to begin, albeit belatedly, a career that has given me more joy than I ever thought possible. It wasn't a conventional route. It wasn't the route my peers took, but it was a pathway to get me where I wanted to go. And every now and again, that was 20 years ago, and every now and again, a particularly observant hospital credentialer will question me about this 2-year gap in my work history. The first time I fielded that question, I was self-conscious, embarrassed, and a little ashamed. 2 years away from medicine. I mean, who does that? Except for Sam Wong, who did for 12 years. When I sheepishly confided that I'd spent that time taking care of my kids, the perky woman on the other end of the line laughed cheerfully and she chirped, "That is so cool. We just have to make sure that you aren't incarcerated or institutionalized." And it's clear that you were neither. As I hung up the phone, I concluded that she must not have kids. Because otherwise she would know that early parenthood feels on many days a lot like those. This brings us finally to gratitude. It is said that the happiest people in the world are not necessarily those who have a lot of material wealth, but those who are grateful for life's riches that they do have. It's hard, though not impossible, to really know gratitude when you're young because it takes some life experience to appreciate how bad things can get. And they can get very bad. Substance abuse, divorce, mental illness, financial trouble, a dying parent, or worse, a dying child. We all know someone dealing with these issues, and sadly, as we've heard, some of us are likely struggling with some of these things ourselves. In medicine, we have a front row seat for some of the worst that life can dish out. And perhaps because of this proximity, I think we physicians appreciate life more fully than most other professions. Some of the greatest lessons in gratitude have come from my patients. Sometimes it's the homemade Polish paczkis around Easter, or the slab of ribs from a Southside soul food caterer. Even $400 from a high-powered attorney slipped surreptitiously into my coat pocket, along with a note of apology for how little his insurance company had paid before surgery. But more often it's not the gift, it's the thought behind the gift, a heartfelt handshake, the tears of relief and appreciation, or an unsolicited hug. These gestures of gratitude are powerfully motivating and a reminder of what's really important in this journey of life. That child, the one who accompanied me on all my fellowship interviews, who by way of my distended abdomen announced to the world my utter lack of reproductive restraint, he took the MCATs last month. When my friends hear of his medical ambitions, they say, some joking, some not. What? You haven't talked him out of it yet? Yes, medicine is different now than it was when we patrolled the wards as eager and idealistic 20-something medical students. And we've been treated to some of the exciting changes by my classmates today. Henry, Claire, Andrea. I mean, students now learn from lifelike robotic dummies that bleed, asphyxiate, and cry out in pain, just like real unsuspecting patients. Surgeons operate remotely, manipulating pincers and scissors from a cockpit like a drone pilot half a world away. An office visit in 2013 can mean an email picture downloaded to the electronic medical record, accessed through the phone you carry in your pocket, all while you're at your kid's recital. I think you can upload the CPT for that. We are less sanguine, however, about things that are not so cool. How keystroking and data entry can be a barrier between the way we communicate with our patients. How third parties can erode our role as patient advocate. And how physician employment and vertical and horizontal integration can threaten the very fundamental tenets of medicine as a professional guild. I think every generation of doctors worries about the next generation. Those of you here for your 35th, 40th, or up reunions, admit it. You were worried about us class of aviators, weren't you? Come on, didn't you just think a little bit? It won't be the same for them. The glory days of medicine are over for suckers. Things will be different for my son's generation than they were for ours. And we've heard from my classmates today how this will be. But let me tell you what won't change. As we all eat and breathe, one day we'll struggle to eat and breathe. And finally, we won't eat or breathe at all. And during that universal journey, almost everyone, be she rich and powerful or unique and disenfranchised, will turn to us, the healing profession, in that greatest hour of emotional and physical need. And we've heard how technology can make us better clinicians, but there's no app for the compassion that our patients need and crave. The privilege and honor that we have, the laying on of hands we've heard so much about today, will not change. Who else can touch a patient in places perhaps only a lover has touched? Who else can ask a question that would be unspeakable in any other setting? Who else can literally hold a patient's heart in their hand? Lawyers don't get to do that. Investment bankers don't get to do that. News anchors, actresses, supermodels, professional athletes, all worthy professions, but they don't get to do that. We get to do that. As we conclude this day of communion and union, let us all reflect on how our colleagues, perhaps many in this room, stepped up along with all of Boston after the unspeakable act of terror that took place just down the street last month. Never before has our extended Harvard medical community been on such a live public world stage. I was riveted to the nonstop coverage on the news. I was carefully scanning each doctor who was interviewed, looking for classmates, former professors, or any other names I might recognize. I was so very proud of our profession, so very proud of my fellow HMSers who pulled extra shifts, came in from home, performed their jobs under the most stressful and wrenching of circumstances. So very proud. Thank you for your service. Thank you for reminding us all of why we are so fortunate to be doctors, so privileged to have begun this at once humbling, terrifying, and thrilling professional journey right here. In the weeks since the bombings, I've watched the interviews of some of the good Samaritans who, without regard for their personal safety, stuck around to help the injured in the moments after the blasts. The man in the cowboy hat, the Red Sox fan who used his shirt as a tourniquet and spared a young girl her leg. I was struck by how moved these lay first responders were. They were often more emotional during the interviews than the victims that they had helped. In those few frightening and terrifying minutes, they got to feel what it was like to alter the course of someone's life. We, my friends and colleagues, we get to do that every day. It's been my honor and humble privilege to stand before you today. Thank you.
It seems anticlimactic in some ways to have a panel discussion, and we are a bit over time. So